They were told they had nothing left. No home, no future, no voice. What happened next began with a single step in their own backyard and led to a truth buried for decades. A truth someone never wanted to be found. This is not a story about luck. It's a story about what happens when ordinary people refuse to disappear quietly. Watch closely, and before we begin, subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you enjoy deep, emotional stories. Also, write in the comments which city you're watching from. Morning came to Riverside, Indiana, without ceremony. The light slid through the thin curtains of the small house on Maple Grove Street, touching the familiar shapes of furniture that had not moved in decades. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, as if it already knew it no longer belonged to the people inside it. Ethan Wilson sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. At 67, his movements had slowed, but his mind was sharp enough to understand exactly what this day meant. Across from him, Margaret folded clothes with careful precision, smoothing each piece before placing it into an old suitcase. They had only 2 suitcases between them. After 48 years in the same house, that fact alone felt like an insult. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. It had been there since their daughter was in elementary school, its steady rhythm once marking school mornings, holidays, and late dinners after long shifts. Now it marked the last hour they would ever spend in this house as its owners. Laura stood near the doorway, arms crossed, her car keys clenched tightly in her hand. She looked exhausted, but not from grief. Her exhaustion came from numbers, phone calls, and sleepless nights spent worrying about bills. She had delivered the news the night before in a flat, businesslike voice, as if discussing a change of internet providers. "I've already signed everything," she had said. "The house is sold. The buyer transfers the funds next week." Margaret had stared at her then, waiting for a second sentence that would soften the first. It never came. Now, in the cold morning light, Laura cleared her throat. "The taxi will be here soon. St. Anthony Senior Residence already confirmed the room. It's temporary, until you get settled." Ethan looked up at her. "We're settled," he said quietly. "We've been settled here for most of our lives." Laura avoided his eyes. "Dad, please, we've been over this. I didn't have a choice." There were many things Ethan could have said. He could have reminded her that they had never asked for money, that they had paid off the mortgage years ago, that this house was the only thing they truly owned. Instead, he nodded once and stood up. His knees protested as he did. Age had made even simple movements expensive. "I'll take the last suitcase," he said. Margaret reached out, touching his arm. Her fingers trembled. She had cried through most of the night, quietly, so Laura wouldn't hear. Now there were no tears left, only a dull pressure in her chest that made breathing feel heavy. Ethan stepped outside into the backyard. The grass was damp with morning dew. A tall maple tree stood near the fence, its roots twisting beneath the soil. He remembered planting it with his father, decades ago, when the yard was bare and his hair was still dark. That tree had watched their daughter grow up. It had watched birthdays, arguments, and long summer evenings pass. As Ethan crossed the yard, the toe of his shoe caught on something solid. He stumbled forward, barely managing to keep his balance. The suitcase slipped from his hand and hit the ground. "Damn it," he muttered. He looked down and saw a stone, partially exposed near the base of the maple. It was larger than the others around it, its surface smooth, unnatural. When he placed his hand on it to steady himself, the stone shifted. Ethan froze. He pressed again, harder this time. The stone moved, sliding slightly to the side with a low, grinding sound. Beneath it, darkness opened where there should have been earth. "Margaret," he called, his voice unsteady. "Come here." She appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "What is it?" "There's something here." She walked toward him slowly, wiping her hands on her cardigan. When she saw the opening, her breath caught. The hole was rectangular, carefully shaped, not the work of roots or animals. Stone lined the edges, arranged with intention. "That can't be," she whispered. Ethan knelt with difficulty and leaned closer. Cool air rose from below, carrying the faint smell of dry earth and old stone. This was no accident. Someone had built this. Margaret's heart began to race. "Ethan, what if it's dangerous?" He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "What danger is left, Margaret? We've already lost the house." He returned moments later with an old flashlight from the garage. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing shallow stone steps descending into a small underground space. The walls were solid, dry, carefully constructed. They looked at each other in silence. After all these years, something had been waiting beneath their feet. Carefully, they descended. The space below was no larger than a walk-in closet. In the far corner sat a rusted metal box, heavy and square, as if placed there deliberately and never meant to be touched again. Ethan lifted it with shaking hands. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth yellowed with age, were papers. Maps. Letters. The ink was faded, but legible. Margaret held the flashlight while Ethan unfolded the first document. His breath stopped. "It's a deed," he said. "Margaret, it's a deed for this property." She leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "That's not right. Look at the boundaries." The lines extended far beyond what they had always believed was their land. "There's a name here," Ethan said. "Samuel Wright." Neither of them recognized it. Another letter fell open, handwritten, dated more than 70 years earlier. It spoke of hidden truths, of land sold dishonestly, of proof concealed for the day it would be needed most. Footsteps sounded from the front of the house. A car door closed. "The taxi," Margaret whispered. Ethan folded the papers carefully, his hand steady now with something he had not felt in a long time. Purpose. They climbed out, replaced the stone, and erased every sign of disturbance. When Laura stepped into the yard moments later, she saw only two tired parents standing beside old suitcases. The taxi waited at the curb. As they drove away, Margaret looked back at the house, her heart breaking. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. A fragile, terrifying hope. They had lost their home, but they had just found the truth. St. Anthony Senior residence smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. The building stood on the edge of Riverside like an afterthought, a long brick structure with narrow windows and trimmed hedges that felt more symbolic than welcoming. When the taxi stopped, Ethan paid the driver in silence. Margaret stepped out slowly, gripping her handbag as if it were the last thing anchoring her to the life they had just left behind. Inside, the floor echoed under their shoes. A woman at the front desk glanced up and offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Wilson, room 12, she said, checking a list. "Second floor. Lunch is at noon." Room 12 was small. 2 narrow beds, a single dresser, 1 window facing the parking lot. Margaret sat down first, the mattress creaking under her weight. For the first time since the morning, her composure cracked. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself not to cry. Ethan placed the suitcases near the wall. Inside one of them, carefully wrapped in a sweater, lay the metal box. He glanced at it, then at Margaret. "We'll look tonight," he said quietly. That night came slowly. Sounds traveled easily through the thin walls. Coughing, distant voices, a television murmuring somewhere down the hall. When the lights were finally off and the building settled into uneasy silence, Ethan pulled the box from the suitcase and placed it on the bed between them. Margaret turned on the small lamp. Its yellow glow felt intimate, conspiratorial. They spread the documents across the bed. Deeds, maps, handwritten letters. The more they read, the clearer the pattern became. The original property lines were not just slightly larger, they were dramatically larger. Half of what they had always believed belonged to their neighbor's business was marked as part of the Wilson land. "This isn't a mistake," Margaret said softly. "This was hidden on purpose." One letter stood out. Samuel Wright wrote in careful, deliberate handwriting. He described himself as a land surveyor hired by Colonel Henry Collins during the rapid development of the area after the war. The letter spoke of falsified measurements, overlapping sales, and families who never realized they had been cheated. "I cannot expose this openly," the letter read. "Those who try are silenced, but the truth must survive. If you are reading this, it means you have lost something dear. Only then will these papers matter." Margaret's hands trembled as she folded the letter. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew this would only be found when someone was desperate enough to look." Ethan stared at the map. "And we lived on top of it for 48 years without knowing." Sleep never came. By morning, they had made a decision without speaking it aloud. They left the residence early, telling the front desk they were going for a walk. The air outside was crisp. The house on Maple Grove Street looked unchanged from the sidewalk, but to Ethan and Margaret it already felt different, like a place holding its breath. Laura's car was gone. Ethan unlocked the back gate with the spare key he had kept hidden for years. They crossed the yard quickly and moved the stone again. This time, they took their time. The underground space revealed more than they had seen the day before. Tool marks on the stone walls, scratches where hands had worked tirelessly in secret. In the back, a narrow passage sloped downward, barely wide enough for one person. Margaret hesitated. "Ethan, I know," he said. "But if this leads where I think it does, we need to see it." They moved slowly through the passage, the flashlight beam shaking. The tunnel extended farther than either of them expected. Finally, it ended beneath a thin layer of stones and dirt. Ethan pushed gently. Light filtered through. They were under the edge of the neighboring property. Above them, the low hum of machinery vibrated through the ground. Margaret's breath caught. "That's Thompson's Supply." Ethan nodded. This tunnel was built to reach this land. He wouldn't have done that if it didn't matter. Back in the main chamber, they searched carefully. Behind a loose stone, they found additional letters and a folded hand-drawn map marked with initials and dates. Samuel Wright had documented everything, even the names of buyers involved in the dishonest sales. Fear settled in slowly. Whoever had benefited from this deception had built a life on it. They covered the entrance again and left before Laura could return. The walk back to St. Anthony felt longer. That afternoon, Margaret sat alone in the common room, watching residents play cards. Their laughter sounded distant, disconnected from reality. Ethan joined her, holding a folder of notes he had made. "We can't ignore this," he said. "If we do, it dies with us." "But what if no one believes us?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Then we make them believe." That evening, as the sun set behind the parking lot, Margaret realized something with startling clarity. The house had been taken from them, but the past had given them something else. A reason to stand up even now, when the world expected them to sit quietly and fade. They went to bed with fear in their hearts. And resolve. The following morning, Ethan and Margaret stood across the street from Thompson's Supply Kapiorwak, watching forklifts move pallets of concrete and lumber with mechanical indifference. The business occupied a wide stretch of land, its warehouse stretching farther than it ever should have. For years, they had seen it as just another part of the neighborhood, loud but harmless. Now it looked different. Now it looked like theft made permanent. Ethan inhaled slowly and crossed the street. Margaret followed, her hands clenched inside her coat pockets. Robert Thompson stood near the open bay door, giving instructions to 2 employees. He was a broad man in his mid-50s, his confidence visible in the way he filled space. When he noticed them, his mouth curved into a practiced smile. "Well, if it isn't Ethan and Margaret Wilson," he said. "I thought you'd moved out." "We did," Ethan replied evenly. "But we needed to ask you something." Thompson's eyes flicked briefly to the warehouse behind him, then back to Ethan. "Ask away." Ethan gestured vaguely toward the property. "Do you know much about the original boundaries of this land, from when it was first sold?" The smile faded. "Not completely, but enough to be noticeable." "I bought this place legally," Thompson said. "All the paperwork was clean." "That's not what I asked," Ethan said quietly. For a moment, Thompson said nothing. Then he shrugged. "Look, I don't have time for history lessons. Whatever you're getting at, you should talk to the county." Margaret stepped forward. "Do you know the name Samuel Wright?" Thompson stiffened. It was brief, but unmistakable. "No," he said too quickly. "Never heard of him." Ethan nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you for your time." As they turned to leave, Thompson's voice followed them. "And Ethan? You should be careful. People might get the wrong idea. 2 elderly folks poking around with old stories." The message was clear. Back at St. Anthony's senior residence, the encounter weighed heavily on them. Margaret sat on her bed, staring at the wall. "He knows," she said. "He knows something." "And he's afraid of it," Ethan replied. "That's good. Fear means leverage." They decided to speak to Laura that evening. She arrived late, irritated by the call. "I don't understand why you dragged me back here," she said. "I have work tomorrow." Ethan laid the documents out on the table between them. Laura glanced at them without interest. "Dad, please," she sighed. "This is grief talking." Margaret's voice broke. "This is proof." Laura picked up one map, scanning it briefly before setting it down. "Old papers don't mean anything. Even if this was true once, it's too late now." "So you won't even look into it?" Ethan asked. Laura shook her head. "I can't get involved in fantasies. I sold the house. It's done." When she left, something between them fractured permanently. The next day, Ethan went alone to the county records office. Dusty shelves lined the back room, filled with ledgers older than the building itself. A clerk directed him to a table and left him to search. Hours passed. When Margaret joined him later, he looked up with eyes burning from strain. "There are contradictions," he said. 2 deeds for overlapping land. Different buyers, same seller." Her heart pounded. "So it's real." "Yes," he said. And it was never resolved. That afternoon, they sat across from Daniel Foster in a cramped office above a closed bookstore. He was young, barely 30, with tired eyes and a careful manner. "This is complicated," Daniel said after reviewing the documents. "Cases like this can take years, and there's no guarantee." "We don't have years," Margaret said softly. Daniel hesitated. "If I take this, I'd have to work on contingency. I can't afford to do it otherwise." Ethan nodded. "If we win, you're paid. If we lose, you're not." Daniel looked at them for a long moment, then extended his hand. "All right." The first survey request went out the next day. Thompson responded with hostility. He appeared at the residence 2 days later, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "You're trying to steal my land with fairy tales," he snapped. "If you keep this up, people will start asking questions about your mental state." Sister Margaret intervened, ordering him to leave. The damage was done, but not the way Thompson intended. Whispers followed him instead of them. As the surveyors prepared their equipment, Thompson stood watching from a distance, his jaw clenched. Ethan met Margaret's gaze. "There's no turning back now," he said. She nodded. The wall of disbelief had been breached, and beyond it waited a fight neither of them had planned for, but both were now ready to finish. The days leading up to the hearing passed with a tension that settled deep into Ethan's bones. Every morning at St. Anthony Senior Residence began the same way, with the rattle of carts in the hallway and the low murmur of voices, but nothing felt routine anymore. Margaret noticed how his hands shook slightly when he held his coffee, how he stared at nothing for long stretches of time. The weight of what they had started pressed on them both, heavier than the years they carried. Daniel Foster worked quickly. He filed motions, requested technical surveys, and contacted anyone whose name appeared in the old letters. The first breakthrough came with the land inspection. Early one morning, surveyors arrived at Thompson Supply Co. with court authorization. Robert Thompson was already there, pacing near the fence, his anger barely contained. He argued loudly, claiming the inspection would disrupt business, but the paperwork was clear. He had no choice. Ethan and Margaret stood at a distance, watching as modern instruments were set up over land that had once been nothing more than lines on a forgotten map. The technicians worked methodically, digging carefully at specific points marked in the old documents. Within hours, they uncovered stone boundary markers buried beneath decades of dirt and debris. The stones were weathered, but unmistakable, placed long before the warehouse had ever existed. These markers match the original 1948 survey, one of the engineers said, looking up from his notes. They predate all later construction. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She gripped Ethan's arm, grounding herself in his presence. This was no longer just paper and ink. The land itself was speaking. Thompson watched in silence, his face tight, his confidence visibly eroding. A week later, Daniel arrived at St. Anthony with unexpected news. "Someone contacted me," he said. "Her name is Helen Collins." The name struck like a distant echo. Colonel Henry Collins. "She's his granddaughter," Daniel continued. "She read about the case in the local paper." Helen Collins arrived the next afternoon. She was in her mid-70s, dressed simply, her posture straight despite her age. When she sat across from Ethan and Margaret, her eyes filled with tears. "I came to apologize," she said. "My grandfather destroyed lives. I've known it for years, but I never thought I'd meet people who were still suffering because of him." She opened her bag and placed a worn leather ledger on the table. "This is his accounting book. He kept records of everything, even the things he didn't want others to see." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. There it was, the sale to Walter Wilson, the partial payment from Edward Thompson, no record of completion. "This changes everything," Daniel said quietly. The news spread quickly. Thompson's reaction was immediate and vicious. He confronted Ethan and Margaret in the hallway of the residence, his voice shaking with rage. He accused them of destroying his business, of manipulating the courts, of turning their own daughter against him. When that failed, he changed tactics. Laura arrived 2 days later, pale and frantic. "I sold the house," she said, barely able to meet their eyes. "To Robert Thompson. He offered more than market value. I thought it would solve everything." Margaret felt something inside her break. "You sold it to him?" she whispered. Laura nodded, tears spilling down her face. "I didn't believe you. And now he says, if you win, he'll come after me." The betrayal cut deeper than any threat Thompson had made. Ethan said nothing, his silence heavier than anger. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Longtime residents, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the benches. Judge Catherine Anderson presided, her expression calm but unreadable. Daniel presented the case with precision. The hidden documents, the survey results, the stone markers. Helen Collins's ledger. Witnesses spoke of long-standing rumors, of land disputes quietly buried by influence and money. Thompson's attorney argued forcefully, dismissing the evidence as outdated, irrelevant, and discovered too late to matter. He questioned the mental state of the plaintiffs, suggesting confusion born of age and stress. Judge Anderson listened without interruption. When the hearing ended, she folded her hands and spoke evenly. "I will review all evidence carefully. The court will reconvene for a decision." As the room emptied, Ethan and Margaret remained seated for a moment, too exhausted to move. Outside, the sky had darkened. They had laid everything bare. Their past, their pain, their dignity. Now, all that remained was to wait. The courtroom was silent when Judge Catherine Anderson returned to the bench. Ethan and Margaret sat side by side, their hands intertwined, feeling every year of their lives in the tightness of their shoulders and the shallow rhythm of their breathing. The past weeks had stretched endlessly, filled with waiting, whispers, and sleepless nights. Whatever happened next would not change their age, or erase the pain of being cast out of their home, but it would decide whether that pain had meaning. Judge Anderson adjusted her glasses and began to read. Her voice was steady, precise, unhurried. After reviewing the historical records, the technical survey, the original accounting ledger of Colonel Henry Collins, and the testimony presented, the court recognizes the validity of the original 1948 deed held by the Wilson family. The partial transaction involving Edward Thompson is deemed incomplete and legally insufficient. Therefore, the court rules in favor of Ethan and Margaret Wilson. A low murmur spread through the room. Margaret felt tears rush to her eyes, not from shock, but from release. Judge Anderson continued, her tone firm. The land currently occupied by Thompson Supply Company falls within the lawful boundaries of the Wilson property. The defendant is ordered to vacate the disputed area within 90 days and to pay compensation for 15 years of unlawful use. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, he could not breathe. 48 years of quiet work, of being invisible, of believing that people like them were meant to accept whatever was taken from them, collapsed into a single undeniable truth. They had been right. Robert Thompson stood frozen, his face drained of color. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. But the words no longer mattered. The decision was final. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, voices overlapping, cameras flashing. Ethan and Margaret moved through them slowly, overwhelmed. Daniel Foster walked beside them, smiling in disbelief. "You did this," he said. "You didn't back down." Back at St. Anthony Senior Residence, the atmosphere felt different. Residents approached them, offering quiet congratulations, squeezing Margaret's hands, nodding at Ethan with newfound respect. Sister Margaret smiled warmly, pride shining in her eyes. That evening, Laura arrived. She stood in the doorway of their room, smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence she once carried so easily. Her voice shook. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't believe you. I was wrong." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You sold the house to him," he said calmly. Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared. I thought I was saving myself." Margaret reached out, her heart aching despite everything. "We all were." The following weeks passed quickly. The compensation allowed Ethan and Margaret to leave the residence quietly, without ceremony. They rented a small house near downtown Riverside, modest, but filled with light. The first night there, Margaret unpacked slowly, touching each object as if reaffirming its reality. Ethan stood in the doorway, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a new neighborhood, feeling something he had not felt in years. Peace. Robert Thompson approached them once more, his posture altered, humility replacing arrogance. He admitted what they had always known. He had been aware of the incomplete transaction. Greed had kept him silent. He asked for forgiveness, not expecting it, but needing to say the words. Ethan listened, then spoke quietly. The land was never just about money. It was about what was taken without asking. They agreed to sell him a portion of the land necessary to keep his business operating. The transaction was fair, transparent, and final. Laura's sale of the house was undone. The family fracture, while not erased, began to heal. Months later, on a warm afternoon, Ethan and Margaret stood in the backyard of their new home, watching the sun sink low. A small stone path led to a carefully preserved entrance beneath a young maple tree. They had recreated the hidden space, placing copies of the documents inside, not as secrets, but as reminders. "We found it when we had nothing left," Margaret said softly. Ethan nodded. That's when the truth usually shows itself. They had not become rich in the way people imagined. They had become whole. They used what they had gained wisely, quietly, helping where they could, living without fear of the future. Sometimes in the evenings, they talked about the old house, about the years they spent believing that being decent meant being silent. They no longer believed that. Their story spread slowly, not as a legend, but as proof. Proof that dignity does not expire. Proof that justice may wait, buried under stone and soil, but it waits faithfully. As darkness settled, Ethan took Margaret's hand. "We weren't finished," he said. She smiled. "We were just getting started." This story reminds us of something important. Time can hide the truth, but it can't erase it. If this story made you think, if it touched you in any way, support the channel. Subscribe and leave a like. It really helps us continue sharing stories like this. And now tell us, which city are you watching from? Your comment matters more than you think.